All right, Cindy, if you want to go ahead, I think we're ready.
Okay. Well, hi, I'm Cindy Galley again, um, longtime dog musher and now member of the Montana Race to the Sky Board. Welcome to our third and final webinar um, talk on mushing topics. We really thank you for joining us again. We are delighted tonight to have Mitch Sиви, three-time Iditarod champion, as our speaker. Before I introduce Mitch to you, though, I just want to remind you of a couple things. One, the talk is being recorded again, and that will be emailed to you in a few days by Dylan, just as we've done in the past. The second thing is concerning asking questions. We want you to put your questions in the chat like we did before, and then I will share those with Mitch. If there are some questions that seem to be relevant to interrupt his talk, I'll pose those questions to him during his talk, but otherwise probably most of the questions we'll ask at the end. But do feel free to, if you feel free to put your questions in at any time. And we're trying to save some extra time for questions because Mitch really feels that training questions are things that people really benefit from asking their own personal questions about that. So I'll proceed with introducing our speaker. So as I said, Mitch Sиви is a three-time Iditarod champion. Most recent championship was in 2017. He's actually run the Iditarod 28 times, finished in the top 10 18 times. In 2008, after he finished seventh in the Iditarod, he went on to win the All-Alaska Sweepstakes, which was a 400-mile race 2 weeks after Iditarod, and that's run around the area of Nome. The winner-take-all race, and Mitch took all. He ran the race with 10 dogs that had been in his Iditarod team, so it was pretty exciting, pretty impressive. Besides being very successful in Iditarod, Mitch has won a number of other races. He's won the Copper Basin 300, Cusco 300, Tustamina 200, and the Grand Portage Passage. Was a 300-mile race. Also, Mitch has encouraged and helped many other mushers to run the Iditarod. Out of Mitch's kennel, his kennel has entered 67 teams in the Iditarod. So that counts his teams of his handlers, teams for people that have leased from him. So his teams have been a significant presence in Iditarod over the years. Also, his kennel has entered 18 teams in the junior Iditarod. So it is my honor to turn the mic over to Mitch, clearly one of the giants in distance dog mushing. Thanks for being here, Mitch.
Well, thank you, Cindy. That's almost flattering, so I appreciate that introduction. So I've been tasked with sharing with you about training sled dogs, and since the Race to the Sky is a long-distance race, I presume that most of us are leaning that way. However, I will try to share information that will benefit anyone that's involved with sled dog sports, even at a recreational level. So obviously right now, at this time of year, everybody's mostly training on wheels, or I would say almost exclusively on side-by-sides or four-wheelers. There's some parts of Alaska that have snow. I think most of those teams in those areas are still on wheels anyway, but it's a good time when you're using your side-by-side, your four-wheelers, to have, because you have so much more control with wheels than you have on sleds, that it's a good time to work on certain fundamentals with your team. So we'll jump right into it, as we don't have a lot of time. But one of the things to keep in mind right off the bat when you're training on a four-wheeler is that you try your very best to simulate what it's going to be like for the dog if they're pulling a sled. So it's often tempting, especially if you start doing long runs on a four-wheeler, it might be getting cold. It's tempting to use that motor a little bit too much, go a little bit too fast. And so I like to encourage people to, and do it, and myself, when we're running on a four-wheeler, to simulate the speeds that it's going to be when you're on a sled. So going uphill, you should be dropping down to, around 5 miles an hour. Going downhill, go a little bit faster than you might typically go on the flat, and set that speed into your team it's a really good time to establish the speed that you want your team to habitually travel at. So whether that be, for long haul, if you're training a team for 1,000-mile race, you might want to work it in at about 9 miles an hour. Obviously, if you're going faster than that in shorter races, you want to establish that speed, and you have really good control with a heavy wheeler to do that. So it's something that we should be working on right now at this time while we're training. And again, because we have good control, it's a good opportunity to teach your team a little bit of discipline. And by that, I mean just keeping themselves lined out. I'm a big stickler for dogs to be forward oriented. So whenever they get hooked up, and really when you hook up their tug line to the back of their harness, that should be their signal that they're on duty and they should be forward oriented. And that really is a key, at least in my training philosophies, that the dogs have really no business going anywhere but forward. Leaders, of course, when you start training them to steer, they need to respond to those voice commands. But before we get to that, I feel firmly that lead dogs should be trained to hold the line out by themselves. I don't tie the front of the team off, tie the leaders off. I expect them to hold the line themselves. And it's not only a matter of efficiency and practicality, but also a matter of attitude, that the leader knows when they're in harness and up there in front that they're on duty. So they should be holding the line themselves. And it takes some work. You have to, reaffirm and push them from the rump and push them up there and hold them there and give them the stay command. But they'll catch on, especially if they're eager to go. And being forward oriented, again, is real key to that. Another thing that we can really use our four-wheelers effectively for is steering commands. So we know that we train our dogs with voice commands, right? G for right, haw for left, straight ahead. And something that people often miss when they're training voice commands into their dogs is the use of the brake and how to use the brake. So as you all realize, if you hook up dogs, they really want to go, they get really excited. Well, in training the steering commands, if you stop the dog at an intersection, or say they don't take the command and you stop them, the thing that they're looking for is to be able to go again. So you use your brake to hold them so that they can't go until they go the right way. And then you need to immediately get off the brake and let them go that way so that they get the reward for doing the right thing. If they go the wrong way, well, then you hit the brake again. So it's pretty simple to train them by a reward system that they get to go if they go the right way, and they don't go if they don't go the right way. And I see people make mistakes. They'll hold the brake too long and the dog tries to go the right way. They don't get rewarded. They try to go the other way, and pretty soon there's a lot of confusion. Another thing I like to do, and this is important, when you're training the steering commands, you want to use an affirmation or a confidence command. So if you tell your dog to go to the right, you tell them G, they go G, then I like to follow up with a confirmation like good boy or there you go. Because when you give them that follow-up confirmation command, it tells them that they're doing what you want them to do. Well, if all you're facing is, say, a junction in the trail, a split in the trail, and they go the right way, it's not a big deal. But if you're out in the middle of a windblown tundra or on a big lake that's frozen, or out in a field someplace on your wheeler, they don't necessarily have a trail to follow all the time. So you want to be able to give them that affirmation when they're heading in the direction that you want them to go. So imagine that you're out in a huge frozen lake or out in the Bering Sea somewhere, and you want them to turn to the right. You tell them, gee, well, how far right do you want them to turn? And so when you give them that, there you go, you can affirm the direction that you want them to run. So I think that's important. When we're running our dogs on four-wheelers, one of the things we're often dealing with is warm weather, right? So people have their temperature cutoffs and their formulas with humidity and whatever. I'm probably less strict about that than some, because we do run our dogs all summer in our tours, and so they do work somewhat all summer, and they're somewhat acclimated. But when you're dealing with warmer temperatures, it's important to keep a close eye on that and make sure that they're not open mouth panting, they're not getting too hot. But we also use water a lot. We use swimming pools. So let me see if I can share something here. well, good. I'm going to show you a picture of, if I can get there. There we go. My photos are hiding. There we go. Can you see this picture now of the sled dogs in
Yeah,
blue
we do
pools?
see
If
it.
you those little, can you see that? Okay. So just little wading pools, and you just pull up alongside the pools, and dogs will jump right in there and get a drink of water or whatever, cool down. So if it's, even if it's, I mean, I hate to throw out a temperature because people have their differences of opinion, but certainly at 50 degrees Fahrenheit, you can run them just about as far as you want if you can get them in these pools every couple of miles. So the other, let's see, let's share one more thing while we're at it. I was going to show you this is what my sled dogs do in the summertime. So they are doing dry land mushing all summer long, and they're in pretty good condition even throughout the summer. And this is relevant to keep in mind because I'm going to show you here in a minute some spreadsheets that are our mileage charts from the summertime. But you know, these guys are doing these rides, pulling pretty good load of people there on the back on that cart. There's, and you know, sometimes 6 or 8 full-size adults on that cart, so they're pulling, you know, a ton easily. And so they're in pretty good shape when it comes around to fall training. And we'll start looking at our spreadsheets here, and when we get to that, you'll understand that we're starting out at some pretty decent mileages with some of these guys. So something else to mention real quick about fall training, and most of you probably do this, but it's important. We find it important to wash those muddy dog harnesses every day, every time between runs, to cut down on harness rubs that you might get. That's one of your big enemies when you're trying to do a lot of fall training, especially when you start pushing long miles. They're just spending a lot of time in those grimy harnesses, so you have to keep them cleaned up. Let's talk for a minute about feeding, and I'm going to try sort of get through some of these topics so that we do save some time at the end. But I think it's almost impossible to race a dog team in a difficult race like Race to the Sky or any of the longer races, certainly the Iditarod. If the dogs don't eat well and don't eat right, it's almost impossible to stay on a good competitive racing schedule. So we start training our dogs to eat literally as soon as they're weaned, and from 6 to 10 weeks old, the pups are fed twice a day. And you know, we just encourage them to get their systems get going, digestion is doing well, and so forth. But at 10 weeks old, we start feeding our puppies just one time a day. And that's contrary to a lot of maybe conventional wisdom, but we've found over the years, and this is proved out for many, many years now, that even just feeding your puppies once a day, if you feed them all they can possibly eat, they can be fat and only eat once a day. And what happens is you get these chubby little puppies that they're just eating all they can once a day, but 24 hours later, even though they're still chubby, they think they're starving. And so there's really nothing better than for a long distance musher than having a chubby dog that thinks he's starving and wants to eat everything in sight. So it's a really, really good technique to start breaking them in early. That I think something to keep in mind, or a way to think of it, is that mealtime is not something to be missed. It's an event that doesn't happen, you know, every few hours. It's once a day, and it's something that they should learn to appreciate that and not miss it. So you don't see any puppies, you know, sitting out and skipping their meals. And then when you get to your racing dogs, of course, you can't just feed them once a day. So obviously we're going to be feeding them more often, twice a day, usually in the yard. And you need to still train them to eat. And I bring this up, it seems like minutia, but some of this stuff is so critical that the dogs appreciate when you feed them. And those of you that feed dogs regularly, you know what I'm saying. When you go around and feed your dogs and you put the food in the bowl or the bucket or however you're feeding them, and you want them to just dig in and eat everything like right away, like, you know, don't even take your head out of the dish. But you can tell when you go around and feed your dogs, if the dog is not going to eat, he's not really that interested, he's sulking over in the corner, he's not really coming over to his bowl. If I see that, I just will skip that dog. There's no reason to give him food and then give him the opportunity to turn up his nose at it. So again, continuing that idea that mealtime is not something to be missed. I also do nothing to discourage them from eating. I've had some crazy eaters like alligators, and they're almost, you know, a nuisance. Their head's in the bowl, they're knocking the dipper, they're in the way. But I really don't do anything to discourage them. Now, I know some people have a lot more discipline. They don't want their dogs to get in the way, whatever. But I don't want to have any negative associated with eating. And if I have to sort of wrestle them to get the food in the dish, I feel pretty happy about that. Dog that wants to eat that much. Now, in a little while, I'm going to talk to you about a topic that I think is probably the most important thing in getting your dogs to really cooperate with you and work with you as a unit. But right now, I'm going to give you the one exception. So I'm going to preface that. But when you feed your race dogs, we as people want to be very routine. We like to do everything at the same time of day, go out there at certain times and do certain things. And we almost feel guilty if we don't feed our dogs exactly on a schedule or at the same times every day. But I had a really great musher one time tell me that the best way to keep your race dogs eating well is to feed them like a drunk. And of course, that was meant in a little bit of humorous way. But if you think about it, if you don't feed them at exactly the same time every day, and you don't feed them exactly the same thing every day, and if they start to turn up their nose or not act that appreciative, then just skip them for a day. And pretty soon they are reminded that, you know, mealtime is not something to miss. And so I think that's really important. There's many times if I come back from a run, maybe I get back in the yard at 4 p.m, I might feed them right away. And typically this is what I'll do is I like to feed them right away so that it's more similar to what it will be in racing, because you want to get the dogs bedded down and fed right away, but not always. I might just go take a nap first or go out and feed them at 10 o'clock or even 1 a.m. They might have to wait a while. But when I do show up, they always appreciate me. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. Let's take a quick look at these mileage spreadsheets. I promised that we would look at some mileage charts. Let's first look at get this to open. Okay, this is our yearlings mileage chart. And again, remember they were doing tours all summer. Our tours ended late September, so they really didn't have that much of a break. And in our tours, they're doing 1.5 to 2 mile runs, and sometimes as many as 6 times a day. So they're actually doing quite a bit of mushing during the summer, and really any temperature that we have in coastal Alaska, which granted is not that hot, but it can be certainly warmer than 50 a lot of times. So these have just gotten going this month, October. And you'll notice at the top, I had it lined out that they were going to run every other day, but our musher is an overachiever, so she's running them every day. I didn't discourage it. They're doing fine. And she's got a bunch of them. If you look over here on the left side, there's a whole bunch of yearlings. And then the tour dogs are only going occasionally, just so they don't get bored. But so that's what the young dogs are doing, the yearlings. And we build them up very gradually. It's going to take them till the end of November to hit 20 miles. And then I like to do lots of 20s. It seems like at 20 miles with young dogs, it's a real run. They feel like they've done something, but they're not going to get discouraged. And you find that everybody can do 20s. When you raise a lot of pups like I do and raise a lot of dogs, 20 miles seems to be a point at which some of them, and by some, I mean 1 out of 35 maybe, might decide that it's not fun anymore. And so that dog is a tour dog. They're not a long distance dog. And I will say that when we harness break our youngsters, we never have one that doesn't want to run at all. So every dog that's born at our place has a job, whether they end up being a lifelong tour dog and actually paying for themselves rather than making us broke with racing. But everybody has a job at some level. But it seems like at 20 miles, a lot of them feel like that's long enough. And so, and again, not a lot, I shouldn't say a lot, but occasionally. So by doing lots of 20s and 25s with our yearlings, we give them an opportunity to break through that kind of barrier and find their legs and make it on through the season. I haven't finished this chart out all the way, but we'll also do a lot of 40s. And then for my yearlings, the goal is to have a back-to-back 40 or 50 mile run where they would do a 40 and go camp for maybe 6 hours and 40 back. And that's all we really need to do with them. The philosophy here with the yearlings is that they just really love to run. We're not really trying to perfect anything. We're not trying to, even really train for an event. And again, they all love to run if we don't discourage them or if we don't scare it out of them, so to speak. So we want them to have a lot of fun, have no real bad events where, it might make them think that this isn't all that fun, and basically get them ready for the following year. So the pup team, then, that's our 2-year-olds. And these guys are training to run the Iditarod. Lara Kittleson will be running them in the Iditarod. And they also did tours up to a point where they got out of it as things started to slow down. And you can see this is a lot more intensive now. So they're doing everyday runs, except for when Lara takes her day off, right at first, 5s, then 10s, 15s, 20s. And then when they get to this point here, we start throwing in an extra day off or so, because these guys have never, these were the yearlings last year. They've never really been in shape before. So we throw in a little bit more time off than what we will with the A-team guys. And they're going to go along like that, building up, doing till they get to 40s. And then shortly after that, you'll see here we got these 80s. Those represent some series. And I'll bring that up in a little bit. Simulated racing or race style, event style training. So here's the A-team schedule. And they started a little bit earlier. They got out of the tours a little bit sooner. And we started running all of the younger ones. We have a few that are like 5, 6, and 7-year-olds, but most of this group is really very young. They're 3 and 4-year-olds, which is young for us in the A-team. And so they've built up rather quickly. If you can see what they did here. They just kind of did 1 5 and then a 10, and then or a group of 10s and then some 20s. They're right up there now, doing 40s, and we'll soon be doing 50s, and we'll do our first series the first part of November. And I'd like to touch on that because we find that when we're trying to pile on miles, a lot of times we tend to, run our dogs either 2 days on, 1 day off, or every other day or whatever. And that's fine up to a point. But at some point, I feel that we need to start training our dogs to do the event that they are going to do. We need to train them for what we want them to do. And that's where we started doing event style or simulated race training. And it turns out now that the majority of the miles that we put on our dogs in the wintertime, if we exclude all the summer activity, but the majority of the miles are actually in simulated racing. So we do not necessarily exactly a race schedule all the time, but eventually we finish off with some long series where the dogs are doing exactly what they will do on the Iditarod. And that really has a lot of benefits, because obviously on a long race, every run is not right after a day off, right? So if you give your dog, even if you ran your dogs every day, even if you say you're doing 20s, how long does a 20-mile run take you? I mean, at most 2.5 hours on the trail. So they're still getting, almost the whole day off, right? So every time you hook up your dog team, they've been laying around for 20, 22 hours doing nothing. So it's not at all like it's going to be trying to get them up off the straw and go in a race, maybe after only 4 hours or 6 hours of rest. So we like to work that into their psyche and into their physicality. Another way to think about that is you've trained them to run, and now you need to also train them to rest, so they maximize their time and even their physiology. They'll repair more quickly if they're used to it. there's a lot of other benefits to this event style training. And by that, I mean, we're going to do 300-mile sets. Probably I've done as many as 10 series in a winter, 300 and over, including one that was over 600 miles. And that was in fact in preparation for the 2017 race, which we won and actually set a record by quite a lot. And that team was trained fast, and they were trained just with incredible amount of miles on them and super tough. Not every team can do that, and that's not ideal for every group of dogs either. So, more isn't always better. This particular group could take it, they could do it. And so we'll run them in one of these series and then give them 5 or 6, sometimes 7 days off. And then when we start back in again, you'll see we're doing 5, 10, 20. That's like a buildup. On a 5-mile run, after a break on a 5-mile run, you can see if anybody's gimpy at all. And of course, you should know that when you stop on your break and be working on these dogs if they have sore feet or anything else during these days off. When you start back, you can see whether everybody's all rested up and ready to go on a 5. Even if you discover that you've got a limp in there or something, a dog can usually go 5 miles and back home without re-injuring themselves, and you'll know that dog needs to set out the next series. So we do a 5, 10, 20. It gives them, a couple short runs. They have fun. They're still resting up. They get loosened up and ready to go. And then after that, you're ready to go hit it again. So that's kind of the way those work. And what happens is some of these runs then, like if these hundreds here that I'm got the cursor by, if those are 50-mile runs with say 6-hour breaks, later there'll be 4-hour breaks. The dogs learn to run, to rest, to eat on straw, at the camp. And also they learn how to run a little bit tired. It dials everything down to what it's going to be like on the race. And there's a big psychological shift that happens running a little bit tired. And also they're actually preserve themselves better, so that rather than leaving the yard with reckless abandon every time, full speed after a day or two off, they're getting up and they're taking off cautiously and gently and gradually and warming up and getting going. And you actually have less injuries doing that than you do going wide open or certainly coming out of the gate well rested every time. And then you also can train them for their rhythm, like what they're going to be doing, the run rest cycle and all that with the eating. I want to show you if I can find it here. Nah, let's see. It's hiding behind my app here for the screen sharing, so we'll skip that. But it's important that let me see if I can trying to share one more thing here if I can move it to a different spot on the screen. So there's a picture of my dog teams eating. I don't know if you can, there you go. So we've got 2 teams out camping. This in the orange coats was the team I was running. There's another team that my handler's running. And you'll see that, I don't know if you can see it real well, but what I've got there is when we camp our teams, we have a separate camping line in between our tug lines and our neck lines, so that we spread the dog team out all along the gang line rather than in pairs side by side. And I find that the dogs eat a little bit better when you're camping if they have their own little space, like they're not competing with the other dog right next to them. And I find that we end up running our dog teams on the line, and how we select where we run them on the line is more about how they eat and camp together, or I should say as much as how they eat and camp together as it is how they run, because our dogs are all very forward oriented, very talented, very, committed to their job and whatever. So it almost doesn't matter where I hook them up in the team. But when we camp, I like them to get along well. And there's a lot of psychology and pack psychology that goes on with the dogs when they're eating, because some dogs are kind of submissive, some are kind of dominant, and you'll find that a submissive dog might not eat if he's right next to a dominant dog. And many times sometimes I see a dog not eating, if I just go over there and stand next to him, then he realizes that he's safe and secure and he can start eating. He doesn't have to worry about his neighbor swiping his food. So anyway, this is this is what my teams look like when they're eating on a camping situation. I guess we'll kind of start winding down here and get ready for some questions. But I would say that of all the things that we talk about with training, probably the most important thing that you want to take out of your training and into your racing, assuming that you're a racing team or any difficult even event that you do, whether it be a trip, camping trip, or a race, I think the relationship that you have with your dogs, and this sounds a little bit cliche, but you have to have a close relationship with your dogs. You have to be really in tune with them and they with you in order to get the top performance from those dogs and from yourself in a racing setting. And so, it's worthwhile to think about, well, what is it that creates that close relationship with my dogs? And I can tell you that it's not the musher who is the happiest or who, gives the most ear scratchies or who, sing-songy, always cheerful and that sort of thing. I think the main thing that your dogs rely on you for is consistency. And they really thrive on understanding their relationship with you, on the consistency that you can bring, both in rhythm and routine when you're especially out on the trail, and in your own temperament. And so you want to be, how shall I say it? You need to be firm, but you also need to be friendly, and you need to be calm, not really excitable. And I see sometimes when people they're all super happy with their dogs and they're practically hopping up and down and everything's, baby talk and this and that. And I wonder, geez, how long can they keep that up? Like, are they going to be doing that in, 3/4 of the way through the race, or is that just something that fades away? And so how do the dogs relate to that? So I think the more even keeled and the more steady we can be, I think the dogs rely on that. And I think they really feed off of that. It's also an interesting, take that a little bit one step further, but that dogs can, how should I say this? That the dogs can actually smell how you're doing through pheromones, and they can detect how you are feeling, how you're doing, what your attitude is like. And it's important that, you can't fake it. So, it's worth understanding yourself when you're relating with dogs. And especially in a stressful situation, it's worth understanding that you need to manage yourself and actually be in a good space. Even when you get in a difficult situation, bad storm, bad situation, whatever, that you actually are okay with that this is your natural habitat, that you can exude confidence and yet be approachable. And it's a hard thing to discuss, but the dogs understand what's going on. And so when you compare, maybe if you're a dog in a team where the musher is like that versus a dog in a team where the musher's kind of, scatterbrained and emotional wreck and angry and then sad and then, doesn't know what to do. And then you turn around and go back and then you leave again and then they're mixed up and the dogs are like, does this guy know what the heck is going on or not? And so those dogs don't have the confidence to take themselves to the edge of their capabilities either. They always feel like they need to hold something in reserve. And along those lines, and this is something that, there's been controversy about, but you do need to be the alpha of your pack. And that doesn't mean that you're somehow, vicious or mean or whatever. I think our sport has gone way beyond the need to even, address that silliness. It's not about that. It's about being calm and responsible and reliable, being firm, but being consistent, because the dogs rely on you knowing what the heck's going on. They rely on you to be competent and capable. Think about the dog's history and their pack structure for tens of thousands of years, they rely on somebody knowing what to do and somebody knowing where the food is and how to survive whatever circumstance they're in. And if you don't represent that to the team, they feel a real lack, a real need. And I think in extremes, actually, the dogs will start to try to take over, and they will start having fights between themselves because they're uncertain who's in charge, what's going on here. So that's an extreme that we don't ever want to reach. But if you're capable, competent, and the dogs can rely on you, they're going to feel at ease to go ahead with, and make their best effort for you. So I think that's something worth thinking about, how you are doing internally, mentally, psychologically, emotionally, how you're doing. The dogs can tell you can't fake it, and they know. And that's what oftentimes is that intangible difference between people doing really well and almost defying the odds. Like, how does that person do so well with that kind of a kennel or those dogs or whatever? That might be the intangible secret sauce that some of us are missing. So think about that. And I guess I'm ready to take questions if we've got some that something I can address.
Yeah, so thanks, Mitch. That was all very, very good to hear. Very helpful. I think there are a couple of questions concerning training schedule. Someone wondered, how many miles should you have on your team before running a 300-mile race or 100 versus 300 versus like Iditarod? Do you think in terms of total mileage, or do you think in terms more of those sequences that you do?
Yeah, total miles does come into it, but like before a 300, I would like to do at least one, maybe not a 300-mile series, but if a 300-mile race is your goal, I would try to do a 200-mile series and maybe a 260-mile series, and then let the 300-mile race be your next step in the progression. In terms of total miles, it's really interesting to me because nowadays we have around 2,000 miles on by the 1st of January. So when we do a mid-distance race in January, we've got over 2,000 miles on. Back in the day, if whatever that term actually means, but back in the day, I won the Copper Basin, I think twice, with only 1,100 or 1,200 total miles on my team. So things were a little bit different back then. And people used to feel like if they got 2,000 miles on to run the Iditarod, that was plenty. And frankly, there still are people that feel that way. It depends on your goal. I showed you the training schedules there. Lara's running her puppy team of 2-year-olds, they are all 2-year-olds. And their goal is to just finish the Iditarod, not last. And so she will have something like 2,200 to 2,500 total miles on those dogs at the start of the Iditarod. The A team, their goal is to win the Iditarod. That's how they're being trained. And so they're going to be closer to 3,500 total miles on, and maybe even more at the start of the Iditarod. As far as a 100-mile race, I honestly am not very qualified to address that. I'm not much of I don't have much experience with that, but certainly you wouldn't need as many. You would train differently. You would run faster. I'm not the best person to address shorter races like that.
Okay, thank you. What about overtraining? Do you believe there is such a thing as overtraining?
Yes, 100%. You can overtrain, and again, there's many answers to the question, but overtraining is individualized. It's to each individual dog. If you have in our situation right now, we're training 27 dogs for the A team. By the time we get to the starting line, it will have been overtraining for some of them. All right. So some of them they're just going to end up getting, they're going to drop out. They're going to get tired on some of those series, and we're going to just set them aside, and, they'll wait till next year. If you only have 16 dogs for a 16-dog race, well, then you have to train to your bottom dog because you need to keep them all in there. But in the case of haven't, if you've got plenty of dogs, well, you can train to the top dogs, say the top group of dogs, because that allows you to maximize those dogs. If you don't train to the maximum to maximize, say, your best 10 or 12 dogs, then you haven't maximized your team. So that's an individual call as to whether, do you have enough dogs that when your bottom dog gets tired, he can set out or maybe not go on the race. You got plenty of better dogs. But if you've only got a minimum number of dogs, then you almost have to train to your weakest dog, and that of course handicaps the strongest ones. So yes, there's definitely such a thing as overtraining, and certain notable mushers train a lot less than we do, but they also have smaller kennels and they don't have the selection process that we do.
Okay, another question. Is it reasonable to take yearlings into a 200-mile race, 50-mile legs for experience, or do you think they need to wait till they're 2 and over?
I think it's okay, but we don't do it. I think it depends on what you think overall is the best for your kennel. If those yearlings need to go and you take it easy and they're going to run 4, 50-mile runs, maybe you add a little extra rest, I think they can do it. I don't think it's optimal. I think it might be a little bit too hard for some of them, but there may be some that thrive with it. We just take it really easy with our young dogs, because the last thing I want to do is talk them out of wanting to be a sled dog. And that's almost the only thing that can happen to our yearlings, is that somehow we talk them out of wanting to do this, because they bring it to the table. They want to do it. And so we're pretty cautious with the young ones. But no, I think you could run 4 50-mile runs. You might want to add a little bit of extra rest. But I think it's not unreasonable. That's about the most I would do, though.
And I think, Mitch, I think in the past, did you ever have yearlings run Iditarod, or at some point you switched to just 2-year-olds running Iditarod? Is that correct? Or
yes, good call. Yes, we did that. In fact, there was times when we had yearlings like 16, 18 months old that actually we had mushers use them to qualify for the Iditarod, and back then it was only 2 races, but to qualify for the Iditarod and then run them on the Iditarod, and it was clearly too much for them. We realized many times that the puppy team was a better dog team before they started the Copper Basin than they were before when they started the Iditarod. They just got deteriorated from just too much. And there's veterinarians and scientists among you can tell you there's physiology to that. Their joints aren't even fully hardened or formed or whatever until about 2 years old. So we're still dealing with growth plates and all sorts of things. So we now, our puppy team, we call it the puppy team still, but they're actually 2.5, almost going to turn 3 by the time they go on their first Iditarod.
When you did run those yearlings as an Iditarod team, did you feel like in the years that followed that they couldn't reach their same potential then because they had given too much too soon?
Well, to be quite frank, I think we had too many injuries. I don't think it was necessarily that they weren't willing. I just think that running that many miles under those circumstances, I think we had too many injuries. And so yeah, it did affect their future. I mean, and not horrible whatever, injuries, but you'd have sore wrists that would reoccur, and like, oh yeah, he had that his puppy year and that kind of thing. So I just think it's better to let them toughen up and grow up a little bit more. But again, back to the question about a 200-mile race, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. If you keep the speed down and work with the dogs, it can be done.
Okay, here's a question, a more general question. What's your best advice for Iditarod rookies, whether leading up to or training for the race or running the race itself?
Well, the best advice for Iditarod rookies, the best advice for Iditarod rookies is to have a mentor, because there's going to be a million questions, and if you can train in a kennel with somebody that's not only experienced but good and experienced, and that doesn't necessarily mean race, having a great race record, but somebody that's really good with dogs. There's just so much that you have to learn, and then I guess just don't take yourself too seriously. The Iditarod is it's a tough race and it's a big deal, but lots of other people have done it, and have realistic expectations and learn as you go, because that's what's going to happen. You might as well enjoy the ride. But having a mentor is really important, and have a schedule too. Have a realistic schedule that you can stick to, because it takes a pretty good veteran, I think, to make a lot of changes on the trail. I found many years it was best for me to have a schedule all worked out and just stay on that schedule. And if I could stay on it, I'd do well. And if not, well, something changed, out on the trail, conditions or whatever. But I think it's a little bit too much to try and assess what you're going to do all the time, seat of the pants. It does two things. It keeps you from overdoing it, because right here on, it says right on the schedule, I'm supposed to rest 6 hours. You don't get tempted to try to chase somebody else out when you should be resting. And it works the other way too. It says, I'm only supposed to stay 6 hours. I shouldn't be sitting here 8 or 10 hours and letting my dogs get grumpy. So I think having a well-established schedule with moderate expectations, and then just stick to the schedule, and it takes a lot of the mental stress out of it. So I guess that would be two things. Have a good mentor that you can ask a lot of questions, and then have a race plan that is modest, no great high finishing expectations, but a good solid finish, and then just stick to it.
How does your training change as you approach race day? Do you wind down a week before the race, or how do you adjust your training coming into a race?
Yeah. Well, of course, we're mostly looking at the Iditarod for us. So if we run middle distance races, which is what I call 300s, we don't really run them seriously anymore. We just do them as one of our series, one of our training runs, especially if somebody needs a qualifier. But February, leading up to the race start, the first weekend of March, February is a lot easier. I don't try to put on a lot of miles. Sometimes we'll do one series, like our last series in the first week of February. And then often it's just an easier series just to keep in the rhythm, but we'll taper down. And probably 2 weeks before the race, we're not doing much hard at all, but we do keep running them. So I like to do, 20s and 40s, let's say, the last couple of weeks. I said 20s and 140 the last couple of weeks before the race starts, but it's definitely easier. You don't want to take a chance of, of hurting anybody. And again, you've already got a lot of the miles on, you've got a lot of the conditioning done, and it's diminishing returns when you think about it. The more miles you put on, the less valuable each mile is, and the higher your risk is of damaging one of your prime dogs. If a dog makes it all the way to February and he's still in your team, you better start thinking about preserving, not letting him twist an ankle or break a toe or something stupid that could have been avoided because you want to do more miles. So it starts to be a balance and a trade-off there. So definitely tapering down and looking at having dogs healthy, having dogs with good weight on them, happy attitudes, feet in great shape, and ready to roll. So definitely tapering down in February.
You haven't had to do much traveling to run Iditarod, but I know one time you came to Minnesota and ran a race, so you've had that experience of traveling long miles prior to a race. There is that challenge for people that live outside of Alaska of driving those long distances, dogs confined. Do you have any thoughts on dealing with that? I know it's not something you've had to deal with a lot, but any thoughts about that?
Well, we did go out to that Grand Portage race a couple times in Minnesota, and one time my dad and my boys drove the dogs out. I flew out later, and they stopped and ran the dogs here and there, and the team was really fit and ready to go. Another time we just drove straight out there, and I think the dogs were mostly in the truck for a week, and I felt like we lost a tremendous amount of our conditioning. So my advice would be to come, if you're coming up to Alaska for the Iditarod, come as early as you can and don't try to just run straight through drive straight through on the highway. Stop and get them out and run them a few times. I mean, make it an adventure, because they're just losing so much, just confined to that box. And you wouldn't think that just being able to walk around, like they would at home, makes that much difference. But it seems like being stuck in a box just takes a lot of conditioning off of them. So I think I'd run them, if I had to do it again, I'd run them at least every other day on the way up to the race, and I get here as early as possible and get them back in shape again, because they lose a lot on the road. That's a tough one.
Yeah. Okay, here's a slightly different question. Is there a strategy for getting a team to go faster up hills?
Well, when we train our dogs, they know they have to pull me uphill. I don't, in training, I hardly ever help them up the hills, and I slow my four-wheeler down to make them pull me up hills. Now I realize if you're planning for like a stage race or something like that, or a shorter race, you might want to go faster up hills. For Iditarod, and again, that's what I know the most about, I actually don't want them to go that fast. I don't want them to waste their energy trying to go fast uphill, because that's the hardest place to go fast. So I'd rather have them go efficiently, and then go the right speed. So as far as getting them to go faster up hills, I've never really worked on that project. And I think it's a tough place to gain time. I think it's the hardest place to gain time, and unless, and maybe we should define our terms. Faster than what? If all the dogs are pulling and digging in, and you're trotting up the hill, then that's as fast as you need to go. Maybe I'm imagining the wrong thing. I sure don't want them to lope up the hills or something like that on a 1,000-mile race. So I think I've never had to really deal with that, because my dogs are really hard pullers, really dedicated workers. And when I hit a big hill, that's the time when I get out my thermos and pour a cup of tea and, just let them pull me up the hill. So I don't have a strategy for going faster than that. But if you have dogs that are forward oriented, make sure they know how to pull up the hills. And one thing that'll definitely hinder you, something I mentioned earlier, is if you're gassing your four-wheeler up the hill all the time and they expect you to do the work for them, they don't expect to have to pull up the hill. A lot of times that inadvertently happens during fall training with the four-wheelers when we have motors. So that's about as good as I can do on that one.
So in training, you don't help them up hills. In races, do you help them up hills?
Occasionally, but there again, that's the surest way to slow them down, is to help them too much, because then they're waiting for you to do it. Mm-hmm. My dogs understand that it's not my job, not Mitch's job, to push the sled up the hill. It's Mitch's job to be as quick and efficient as he can be at the checkpoint. It's the dog's job to pull me up a hill, and I don't really like seeing eyeballs. I want them straight ahead, pulling hard, getting up the hill. And I don't want them looking back like, hey, hit the throttle there, buddy. This is hard, right? So yeah, I don't help them up hills very much in training. Now, if it's cold, if your foot's freezing, of course, once in a while. But even on a race, it doesn't take them long to realize that you're going to get off and run up every hill. And pretty soon, if you don't get off and run up every hill, then they're looking back at you and not actually pulling. So I mix it up. If I want to help them on a race, I will, every once in a while or every other hill. But I like to also remind them on races that it's still their job to pull me up the hill.
Could you comment about the about carrying dogs in the sled, rotating dogs? I'm not sure. That's probably only a factor in Iditarod. I'm not sure people have done that that probably doesn't make sense to do in a 300-mile race, but do you have any thoughts about that idea of resting dogs by carrying them in the sled?
Well, we certainly, I have a lot of thoughts about it, and my son Dallas has done it very effectively, as I have. In 2017, when I won and set the record and all that, we were running 16 dog teams then, and I was carrying, in the first part of the race, actually half the race, I was carrying 4 dogs at a time. You have to have some really strong dogs to carry 4 of their buddies at a time. And really, honestly, not everybody can do it, and not everybody wants to do it. And it's a tremendous amount of work on the musher. And not only just the effort that it takes. You spend, you might spend 5 to 10 minutes, depending on how quick you are, swapping 4 dogs in, out, and 4 dogs into the sled plus snacking. And it actually makes the entire run sort of stressful, because you're always checking your clock, like, well, 10 more minutes and I got to swap dogs again. And it's just a big project, but it can help if your team is up to it and you're up to it. It can help. It's so complex that it would take, another hour to really delve into it, but it certainly can help. People have been carrying dogs and resting them in the sled for a long time. And I guess one way to look at it, I don't even think of it so much as resting in the sled as I do that it just makes the run a little bit shorter for a dog that gets a ride. And so you can carry a couple of dogs pretty easily, and maybe you carry your favorite lead dogs, and it makes the run a little bit shorter for them. But the way that Dallas and I have eventually done it was you can actually carry dogs enough that it affects your run rest schedule. And then it really becomes an effective weapon if your dogs are able to pull their buddies, and if you, the musher, are able and willing to do all the work that it takes to swap those dogs in and out. But it can be effective for sure.
So now here's another totally different question. When can we expect your next book? Thanks for volume 1.
Well, that's interesting, because there's definitely material for another one. I guess I'm just procrastinating. I've started it, but the longer I procrastinate, my ideas change. So someday, I guess, would be the answer. Would be someday.
Okay, I'm inviting participants to any other questions. I don't think I've missed any. Let's see. One of the things that fascinated me the most about your team was your ability in 2008 to finish Iditarod in 2008, and 2 weeks later win the All Alaska Sweepstakes. And I don't know how many of the participants know about that. Was that sort of a high point for you?
Yeah, I would say the All Alaska Sweepstakes was every bit as thrilling for me, especially winning it, maybe even more so than an Iditarod win. And it was so unique and just captivating, because it was $100,000 winner take all. And it turned out to not be quite like that, because they had local fundraising, and a lot of the other, top finishers got actually pretty decent prizes as well, but nothing like first place. And it was unique because there was no dog drops. You couldn't leave any dogs behind, and we had assistance at the checkpoints, but not in between checkpoints. So it was similar to what it was like in the early 1900s when the All Alaska Sweepstakes was being run the first few times in the early 1900s, before World War I. And there were roadhouses and actually dog barns, and you could pull in and pay somebody, to take care of your team for you. And you could go to the restaurant or the saloon or whatever, and they would take care of your dogs. And so simulating that, we were able to have handlers at the checkpoints and bring our food to the checkpoints and things like that. So it was just unique and different enough that it was just fascinating, a lot of fun. And then the way the race turned out, it was a nail biter. I didn't pass Jeff King and overtake first place till the last 25 miles. So it was a fun race for sure.
I think I remember you saying afterward, I think I asked you, you ran a pretty aggressive schedule in the All Alaska Sweepstakes because you were going to try to win. And I remember you saying something like, well, you didn't know if your dogs could do it, but you tried it and they did it. I mean, am I saying that accurately?
Well, yeah, I mean, you never know when you're pushing, you're pushing to win, you might be in uncharted territory in some ways. But I actually ran a more conservative race schedule, and then my friend Jeff King, I rested actually one more rest overall in the race than he did. It was a 3 hour and 20-minute rest, and I made up that rest in running speed and overtook him at the end. So in some ways it was a more conservative schedule than he did, but what he did I thought was extreme. He ran over 100 miles, I think more than once on that race. And in my view, the long runs are more tiring to a dog team than, say, cutting rest. So, short runs and short rests is more efficient than long runs and longer or medium length rests. So those long runs were hard on his team. Although he finished strong, he did well. I only took 10 dogs because of the fact that there was no return dog. There's no way to return a dog. You had to carry him with you if you didn't want to run him anymore. So I only took the ones I was the most sure of. And as it ended up, I was carrying one dog to last about 50 miles. But all in all, that was not bad. And yeah, it was probably one of the most fun races. And also because my friends and my son Danny were with, they were my crew at the checkpoints, and it was very exciting for them. And of course, when you win, it always makes it, that's always fun. So yeah, it was a great time.
Okay, a couple more questions. Someone asked any specific supplements you recommend or wouldn't be without. I'm assuming that dog supplements and maybe people supplements too.
Yeah, every day, every dog gets what we call 50-50, but it's half Dynamite Showdown, which is a mineral vitamin supplement for dogs. And then there's a probiotic powder also that we mix in there. So they're getting, vitamins and minerals and probiotics. The race dogs, when it's season, training season, they're getting some other things, some vitamin E, zinc, astaxanthin, and a few other things, a couple other things. And we increase the amount of the vitamin and mineral supplement because of the demands on their body. We pretty much double up on that, but they stay pretty strong. I think it helps. I think it's worth it.
Is there a particular probiotic that you recommend?
I can't even remember what it is now. I think it's called CRS Gold. It's actually a horse probiotic that we use the horse stuff because it comes in buckets instead of little packets, and the cost per ounce is a fraction. And I don't think there's a lot of times much difference between the horse supplements and the dog supplements other than the size of the package and the price. So I think it's called CRS Gold.
Okay. Another question, any tips from distance racing you think other classes of races, meaning sprint, stage, mid-distance, would benefit from? Like what are the pearls from long distance racing that would apply to other distances? Any particular?
That's interesting. Yeah, one thing that pops into my mind, my alleged mind, is that the way that mid-distance races are managed, and this may or may not even relate to the Race to the Sky, because I haven't even really looked at how it lays out. But a lot of times the race organizations have, in my view, too much rest time mandated in the checkpoints. And one of the things that's unique about the Iditarod, and even when the Quest was a 1,000-mile race, they didn't have it quite like the Iditarod. But the Iditarod, you're able to run and rest almost as you please. There's not a lot of mandatory rest. There's more checkpoints, but we don't have to stop in a checkpoint. And so you can run and rest your dogs appropriately for their abilities, whether for different times during the race, you want to do things differently. But when a race organization mandates too much rest in the checkpoints, it forces you to get to the checkpoint. It forces you to run a long run to get to the checkpoint. As an example, the Copper Basin, the first run is 76 miles. And you have to serve a certain amount of time in the checkpoints. And so you're almost obligated to make that 76-mile run right out of the box. And I really wouldn't want to do that on a long distance race. So I know this is a little bit different than the question, but sometimes in mid-distance races, I think we do runs that are too long rather than break them up more and do shorter runs and shorter rests. As an example, I think one of the most efficient run rest cycles is a 40-mile run, or roughly 4 hours, and 2 hours off. The problem with that is, for a long distance, the musher can't sustain that. You can barely get your chores done in 2 hours, and booty back up again. Let's say you'd never rest. And I've tried it. I've practiced that, and it's almost impossible. But something like that on a mid-distance race, you could do for 2 or 3 days. So I think that's one of the things that probably would benefit either the mushers or the races themselves, is if they could be more lenient with, allowing mushers to run and rest as they please. Otherwise, I see a lot of similarities between running a 300-mile race or a 400-mile race versus the Iditarod. You can be a little bit more aggressive, obviously, because the finish line comes along and saves you, but it's pretty similar. I mean, you have to get your dogs eating. A 200-mile race, they don't have to eat very well, but a 300, they definitely have to eat, or you're going to fade. And that's some of the things that would be similar to the Iditarod.
I think, let's see, one comment in the chat was, "Thank you, Mitch. This was an amazing and insightful lecture." And I would add my appreciation for your talk as well. I'm sure all the other participants would too. I think we'll wrap it up at this. Dylan, are you there?
I am.
Okay. Thanks again, Mitch. Great talk.
All right. Well, thank you for having me. I enjoyed the opportunity.
And I just wanted to say thank you to everybody who has been registering and following along and being in contact with us. We really appreciate everyone being a part of this, and we want to keep this going. So I'm going to send out another email with this recording, and I'm thinking I'm going to send all of them in one email. So I'll compile all of the recordings together for everyone. So you can just keep one email to keep track of for these. But in that, we're also going to ask for any feedback. So anything that you want us to do different, or that you'd like us to work on for next year, or things that you'd like to see, I'll include an email in there. So yeah, any feedback, we'd appreciate it. And again, yeah, thank you so much. And Mitch, thank you for your time tonight. We all really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Dylan. Thanks for the coach. We'll see you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.